Have you ever wondered what the strongest tornado to have hit your state was? For some states, the answer is pretty obvious and well known, but for others, the answer isn't as clear. In this video, we're going to be going through the tornado history of every US state and taking a look at the strongest tornado to have occurred within each state's lines. And make sure you stay tuned because there are certainly some surprises on this list. Let's begin with the F0 or EF0 states, or state I should say. Alaska is not surprisingly the only US state that strongest tornado on record was either an F0 or EF0. This is due to Alaska's very rugged terrain and typically frigid climate, which is not favorable at all for thunderstorm or tornado development. In fact, you can count all of the tornadoes that have ever happened in Alaska on just about two hands. Moving on to the F1 and EF1 states, we kinda have to bend the rules a little, because there is no state with this being the highest rating, so we'll include the US territory of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has had a handful of tornadoes over the years, with somewhere in the ballpark of 24 being recorded, along with many waterspouts. As for F or EF1s, it has seen 5, which occurred on June 7, 1962, May 5, 1969, August 29, 1974, May 1, 2022, and finally June 16, 2023. Interestingly, Puerto Rico is no stranger to thunderstorms, but tornadoes are rare because that area typically lacks the low-level winds that cause thunderstorms to spin and then produce tornadoes. Continuing on to the F2 and EF2 category, and we have 4 states and 1 district. We might as well stay with the island theme for now and add Hawaii to the list. Since 1950, Hawaii has had around 40 recorded tornadoes, most of which being very weak and the last one occurring a decade ago in 2015. They have had 4 separate F2s though, which occurred on January 28, 1971, 2 of them on February 11, 1982, and 1 on March 18, 1982. In terms of specific weather conditions, Hawaii is similar to Puerto Rico where they do get thunderstorms quite a few days during the year, but typically lack the other ingredients to generate tornadoes. Traveling back over to the US mainland, and we arrive at the 36th state, which is Nevada. It's no surprise that Nevada is this far down on the list due to the state's dry and arid terrain, with only about 80 total tornadoes being recorded since the early 60s. The state has only had one F2 tornado, which occurred all the way back on April 18, 1949. The twister touched down just north of Reno and tracked northeast for nearly 10 miles before dissipating. To find the next participant on the list, we need to travel across the entire country over to the East Coast. Although it too is not a state, the District of Columbia is next on the list, with 3 separate F2s traveling through the area over the years. The first occurred on September 16, 1888, then on April 5, 1923, and finally November 17, 1927. If we keep traveling northeast, we arrive at the next state on the list, which is Rhode Island. Another very small state which certainly plays a factor of keeping it this far down on the list. Rhode Island has seen 2 F or EF2 tornadoes in its history, with the first occurring on August 7, 1986, and the most recent one occurring just a couple of years ago on August 18, 2023. And to cap off the F2 and EF2 category, we're going to be moving to the most northeast state, which happens to be Maine. Maine is the first state on the list where tornadoes aren't exceedingly rare, with the state averaging about 2 touchdowns a year. It also has had too many F or EF2s to name each instance, with about 20 being recorded in the entire history of the state. This is also the first state on the list that has recorded a tornado-related fatality, which did occur all the way back on August 11, 1954, with an F2 all the way up near Caribou. To begin the F and EF3 category, all we have to do is travel 1 state over to New Hampshire. The Granite State has had 3 separate F3 tornadoes in its history, all of which occurred back in the 50s and 60s. The first occurred on June 9, 1953, then again a decade later on May 20, 1963, and the most recent one occurring on August 25, 1969. In an unrelated note, New Hampshire's most impressive tornado occurred back on July 24, 2008, but was only rated as an EF2. This impressive twister tracked for just over 50 miles, injured 2, and claimed 1 life. All of these are fairly impressive though, considering New Hampshire's mountainous terrain and relative lack of tornadoes. Vermont is the next entry on the list, with 2 more F3s occurring within state lines. The first was a brief touchdown that occurred on August 20, 1968. The most recent one, which happened on May 31, 1998, was much more significant though. It actually touched down over the border in New York, just north of Albany, and tracked for over 30 miles before dissipating in Vermont. This notable tornado also injured 68 people over the course of its life. That's it for New England states for now, as we now travel down to the Mid-Atlantic region. Our first state down here is New Jersey. Tornadoes aren't particularly rare in the Garden State, with an average of 2 to 3 occurring each year. The state has also recorded 9 total F or EF3 tornadoes over the years, with the most recent being on September 1st, 2021, from the remnants of Hurricane Ida. The longest tracked tornado in state history, though, was an F1 that occurred on March 10, 1961, which tracked for 59 miles. New Jersey's next-door neighbor of Delaware is next on the list. Despite its very small size, the first U.S. state has seen 3 F or EF3 tornadoes. The first occurred on June 23, 1944, and it was another tornado that touched down in a different state before eventually crossing over into Delaware. This tornado allegedly traveled for 28 miles, but it should be noted that there is strong debate to whether this was actually one tornado or a tornado family. The next one occurred on April 28, 1961, with a very short-lived tornado this time. The most recent instance happened just a couple of years ago on April 1, 2023. This notable tornado trekked for 14 miles and claimed 1 life before eventually lifting. To find the next batch of states on the list, we once again have to travel across the country to the desert southwest, where we arrive in New Mexico. New Mexico usually sees about 10 tornadoes a year and has recorded 9 F3 tornadoes in its history. All of the 9 were relatively short-lived and also all occurred over 45 years ago, with the most recent coming on May 13, 1977. New Mexico's longest tracked tornado was an F2 that tracked for 91 miles on June 5, 1931. Moving west and we arrive at the next state, which is Arizona. Despite the typical desert conditions, the Grand Canyon state has seen 3 F or EF3 tornadoes in its history. The first occurred southwest of Phoenix on August 4, 1957. The second one occurred 15 years later on August 10, 1972 near Prescott, and the most recent one occurred on October 6, 2010 during Arizona's most famous tornado outbreak. Continuing to move west and we get to California. The Golden State has seen 2 separate F3 tornadoes which both occurred near the Arizona state border and both during the 1970s. The first was a short-lived tornado on August 16, 1973, and the second was just down the road a ways on February 8, 1978. The most amazing thing about California's tornado history, though, has to be the slightly unofficial EF3 fire-nado that happened on July 26, 2018 in the Carr Fire. For those that don't know, yes, fire-nados are real and can be very strong. To explain it simply, fire-nados form when intense wildfires generate a rapidly rising column of hot air that begins to spin due to wind shear and other atmospheric conditions. This particular fire-nado had estimated wind speeds of 143 miles per hour and actually claimed 3 lives. Moving on and traveling northeast and we arrive in Utah. The Beehive State has only seen a single F3 tornado, but it was a rather substantial one. It occurred in the northeast portion of the state on August 11, 1993 and tracked for 17 miles. While not the state's strongest tornado, the most famous has to be the F2 that tracked through downtown Salt Lake City on August 11, 1999, injuring 80 and claiming 1 life. The Beehive State's northern neighbor is next up. Idaho has experienced 2 separate F3 tornadoes, but both were admittedly a long time ago. The first instance was on June 7, 1936, just east of Lewiston. This tornado was on the ground for less than a mile, but allegedly claimed the lives of 2 people. The second F3 occurred in the southern region of the state on April 26, 1940, just northwest of Twin Falls. Moving westward once again and we arrive in Oregon, which is probably the state with the biggest asterisk on this list. That's because the state has only seen 1 F3 tornado in its history, which was on April 5, 1972, and it touched down just about on the border of Washington. It crossed into Washington almost immediately after touching down and tracked for a total of 9 miles before dissipating. This was a substantial tornado though, as it tracked through heavily populated areas of both states, injuring 300 and claiming 6 total lives. Washington caps off the list of F and EF3 states and has experienced 3 separate F3 tornadoes, including the one we just mentioned. The first touched down in Seattle on December 12, 1969 and tracked for 4 miles before roping out. The other one occurred on April 5, 1972, which was the same day as the Oregon and Washington border tornado. This one touched down on the other side of the state though, just west of Spokane. It's time to move on to the F and EF4 states, and we will stay in the western half of the country to begin. Montana is first up and has only seen 1 F4 tornado, which occurred on June 29, 1961 near the town of Glendive. This one touched down on the eastern side of town and tracked northeast for 16 miles before roping out. It reportedly also caused 1 injury while it was on the ground. If we travel 1 state south, we arrive at what is probably the biggest surprise on this list for a couple of reasons. Wyoming isn't typically a state that people characterize with strong tornadoes, and it's even more surprising when you learn that Wyoming's only F4 tornado occurred in Yellowstone National Park at 10,000 feet in elevation. This monumental tornado touched down on July 21, 1987, south of Yellowstone and moved northeast and eventually traveled through the southeast corner of the park. It was on the ground for 24 miles and grew to a max width of 1.5 miles. Luckily and not surprisingly, nobody was affected by this rural tornado. This tornado also held the record for the highest elevation tornado until it was dethroned in 2004. Speaking of mountainous states, we're going to round out the western half of the country in Colorado. The Centennial State has seen its fair share of strong tornadoes, with the state recording 6 F4s in its history. The first one touched down east of Denver on August 10, 1924 and tracked for 20 miles and claimed 10 lives. The second one touched down in the extreme southeast corner of the state on June 8, 1928 and tracked for 45 miles before roping out in the Oklahoma Panhandle. This one was also a killer tornado as it claimed 2 additional lives. The third one occurred just a few weeks later north of Denver on June 29, 1928 and it tracked for 15 miles and also claimed 2 lives. The next one touched down on April 29, 1942 near Wiley and tracked for 30 miles and also claimed 4 lives. The fifth one touched down 5 years later on June 8, 1947 and tracked for 20 miles over mainly rural farmland. Finally, the most recent F4 happened in the late 70s, specifically on May 18, 1977. This one actually touched down in Oklahoma before traveling 39 miles and eventually crossing the border and dissipating in Colorado. After once again traveling across the country, we arrive in Florida. The Sunshine State is no stranger to thunderstorms, as it's the state that annually receives the most amount of them during the year. As for tornadoes, Florida has recorded 2 F4s which could not have been more different from one another. The first one occurred on April 15, 1958, and according to historical data was only on the ground for less than a mile. This tornado is also controversial, as numerous people have called into question whether this rating of F4 was actually justified. As for the other tornado on the list, the differences couldn't be any greater. This one touched down on April 4, 1966, and stayed on the ground for a whopping 136 miles as it crossed the entire state. This tornado ended up claiming the lives of 11, making it one of the deadliest in state history. Impressively, the same storm system that spawned this F4 also produced another tornado, which was later rated as an F2, which stayed on the ground for 123 miles and also crossed the entire state. Continuing on and moving northwards along the East Coast, and we get to South Carolina. The Palmetto State typically sees between 14 and 26 tornadoes each year, and has actually seen 16 F or EF4 tornadoes in its history. The first on record occurred on March 20, 1875, and the most recent occurred on April 12, 2020. The state has seen numerous long-tracking tornadoes as well, but the most significant one in terms of loss of life was the one that occurred on April 30, 1924. This particular tornado was on the ground for 105 miles, injured 534, and claimed 53 lives. The longest track tornado in state history touched down on April 8, 1957, and stayed on the ground for 121 miles as it crossed into North Carolina, which conveniently brings up the next state. Just like its sister state, the Tar Heel State has had a pretty active tornado history, with 15 F4 tornadoes recorded. The first on record occurred on February 19, 1884, and the most recent was on May 7, 1998. The deadliest tornado in state history was also the first F4 in 1884, which claimed 23 lives and injured 100. The longest track tornado in state history, though, was not one of the F4s. It was an F3 on November 22, 1992, that tracked for 160 miles in total. Continuing northwards along the coastline, and we enter Virginia. In contrast with both North and South Carolina, Virginia has only seen 2 F4 tornadoes, which occurred on August 6, 1993, and then September 24, 2001. Ironically though, neither of these tornadoes hold the record as the deadliest or longest tracked in state history. The title of the deadliest goes to an F2 that touched down in the extreme western portion of the state on May 2, 1929, and claimed 13 lives and injured 100. The title for the longest track goes to an EF3 that touched down on April 16, 2011, and stayed on the ground for a total of 47 miles. West Virginia has a similar tornado background, as it has also only seen 2 F4 tornadoes in its history, both of which occurred on June 23, 1944. The first one touched down in the northern panhandle and crossed into Pennsylvania, then back into West Virginia, and finally Maryland, where it eventually roped out. This tornado was allegedly on the ground for 98 miles, and it technically is the longest tracked tornado in state history, although it should be mentioned that this was more than likely a tornado family. The other F4 from that day was actually no slouch either, and it's actually the deadliest one in state history. This one tracked for 60 miles, injured 381, and claimed 100 lives. The last mid-Atlantic state to cover for now is Maryland. Maryland has seen 3 F4 tornadoes, including one of the previously mentioned West Virginia ones. The second one in state history touched down in Pennsylvania on June 2, 1998, and traveled 37 miles before dissipating in Maryland. The most famous F4 tornado in state history, and the most recent, has to be the La Plata tornado of April 28, 2002. This tornado tracked for 38 miles, injured 100, and claimed 3 lives. It also notably and famously was initially rated as an F5 before eventually being downgraded to the current rating of F4. New York is the next state in line and has seen 3 F4 tornadoes of its own. The first one touched down in extreme eastern New York on August 28, 1973, and traveled southeast for 10 miles before dissipating across the border in Massachusetts. The second one occurred during the May 31, 1985 tornado outbreak and touched down in Pennsylvania before crossing the border into New York. The most recent F4 occurred on July 10, 1989, where it touched down just west of Albany and tracked southeast for 42 miles. Moving over into New England once again, and we arrived this time in Connecticut. Just like New York, Connecticut has also seen 3 F4 tornadoes. The first F4, which also happens to be the deadliest in state history, touched down on August 9, 1878, and tracked for 11 miles, injured 70, and claimed 34 lives. The next one was the famous Windsor Locks tornado of October 3, 1979. This late-season tornado traveled northwest for 19 miles and claimed 3 lives. It also notoriously hit the New England Air Museum, where it destroyed dozens of vintage planes, which helped certify it as one of the costliest tornadoes in American history. The most recent F4 came on July 10, 1989, in the southern part of the state. Last but not least for the F and EF4 states is Massachusetts. The Bay State has seen 4 F4 tornadoes in its history, including the previously mentioned 1979 Windsor Locks tornado from Connecticut and the 1973 Cannon tornado from New York. The first recorded F4 in state history, though, was the famous Worcester F4 tornado of June 9, 1953. This beast tracked for 35 miles, injured 1,228, and claimed 94 lives, which cements it as one of the deadliest in U.S. history. This tornado has also long been theorized to have been an F5 based off of damage, but has never received the formal upgrade. The most recent F4 in state history came on May 29, 1995 near Great Barrington. This tornado tracked for 12 miles and claimed 3 lives, and has a controversy of its own. That's because it stayed over mainly rural forests, and the F4 rating that was given was based only and entirely off of a single car that was thrown 1,000 feet by the twister, despite the highest structural damage being F3. With the F and EF4 states now being done, that leaves us with one category left, the F and EF5 states. To start off, we don't have to travel that far from New England, as Pennsylvania is our first state. The Keystone State has only seen one F5 in its history, which occurred during the May 31, 1985 tornado outbreak. It initially touched down across the border in Ohio and tracked for 47 miles before roping out near the town of Mercer. This tornado injured 310 and claimed 18 lives as well. While not officially the strongest, another notable tornado occurred during the same outbreak in the central part of the state. This tornado was rated as an F4, but was more than likely much stronger as it stayed over mainly rural forests for most of its life. At its peak, it grew to almost 2 miles wide and was strong enough to shake the ground and register on local seismographs. As previously mentioned, Ohio is also on this tier of the list and has seen 4 F5s. The first one occurred on April 23, 1968, with the next 2 coming on the April 3, 1974 super outbreak. The most recent in state history is the previously mentioned F5 from May 31, 1985. The most notable of these twisters has to be the Xenia F5, which was on the ground for 31 miles, injured 1,150, and claimed 36 lives. Moving northwards to Michigan, and we see a similar case as Ohio. The state has also seen 4 F5s, which all occurred many decades ago. The first occurred on May 23, 1896, then on June 5, 1905, then June 8, 1953, and finally the most recent, which occurred on April 3, 1956. The June 8, 1953 F5, which tore through portions of Flint, claimed 116 lives, which puts it in the top 10 of the deadliest tornadoes in U.S. history. Indiana is next up and has seen 5 F5s within its state lines. The first one came just northeast of Indianapolis on April 1st, 1884. The second was the back end of the tri-state tornado on March 18, 1925, which dissipated not too long after crossing into the state. While some details about this tornado are disputed, such as was it actually one tornado or rather a tornado family, what's not disputed is the fact that it injured 2,027 and claimed 695 lives, which is the deadliest in U.S. history. After this, the three most recent F5s in state history all came with the April 3, 1974 super outbreak. Indiana's next-door neighbor of Illinois is next, and has seen 5 F5s itself. The first one occurred on April 24, 1880, just southeast of Springfield. The second one was the middle portion of the previously mentioned tri-state tornado on March 18, 1925. The third occurred on March 16, 1942, just north of Peoria. The fourth was a relatively short-lived tornado in the southern part of the state, which was only on the ground for 5 miles or so. Finally, the most recent is the Plainfield tornado, which hit on August 28, 1990, and notoriously hit without any warning, leaving 29 people dead. Moving back southeast and we get to Kentucky, which has seen just 2 F5s. Both of these were already previously mentioned and occurred during the April 3, 1974 super outbreak. However, if we want to talk about tornadoes that were probably of EF5 strength within state lines, then the December 10, 2021 Mayfield EF4 needs to be talked about. This beast was on the ground for 169 miles, which is a state record, and claimed 58 lives, which is the third highest total in state history. Continuing southwards and we get to Tennessee, which has seen 4 F and EF5 tornadoes. The first one came over 100 years ago on March 11, 1923, southeast of Jackson. The second one was the tail end of another April 3, 1974 super outbreak F5, which began in Alabama and lifted in Tennessee. The third would occur 24 years later on April 16, 1998 by Lawrenceburg. Finally, the most recent one in state history came during the April 27, 2011 super outbreak. This EF5 was a long tracker that was on the ground for 132 miles and touched down in Alabama before lifting in Tennessee. Even though this tornado spent most of its time in Alabama, it claimed 72 lives in total, which technically makes it the deadliest tornado in Tennessee state history. The next state on the list is Georgia, and it's admittedly another state that's similar to Oregon. The Peach State has only seen 1 EF5 tornado in its history, and it was only in the state for about 3 miles, but it counts. Anyways, this was another one of the EF5s from the April 27, 2011 super outbreak, which again touched down in Alabama before dissipating in Georgia. This tornado, more commonly known as the Rainsville tornado, traveled for 37 miles and claimed 25 lives. Alabama, as we've mentioned already, is no stranger to violent tornadoes and has seen 9 F or EF5 tornadoes. The first one in state history touched down on March 3, 1966, and was one of the most notable as well, as it was on the ground for 203 miles and is the longest track tornado in state history. After this, the state saw 3 more F5s during the April 3, 1974 super outbreak. On April 4, 1977, another one tore through the northern side of Birmingham. 21 years later, on April 8, 1998, another tornado took a very similar path through Birmingham once again. Finally, the state saw another 3 EF5s during the April 27, 2011 super outbreak. Mississippi is also another notoriously active state, but has seen slightly less F and EF5 activity, with 7 in state history, including a few that we've already mentioned. The first one occurred on April 5, 1936, and tore through the heart of Tupelo. This tornado was only on the ground for 15 miles, but injured 700 and claimed 216 lives. This tornado is the 4th deadliest in US history, but ironically isn't even the deadliest in state history. That title actually belongs to an F4, which touched down on May 7, 1840, and claimed 317 lives. Anyways, the state saw 4 other F5 tornadoes scattered throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s before recording the 3 most recent ones during the April 27, 2011 super outbreak. Louisiana is another semi-controversial state, as it has seen two F5s, but neither spent that much time actually in the state. The first occurred on December 5, 1953, and was on the ground for just about a mile in Louisiana before crossing into Mississippi. It was only on the ground for 9 miles in total, but plowed straight through Vicksburg and injured 270 and claimed 38 lives. The most recent one occurred 18 years later on February 21, 1971. This tornado spent about 30 miles in Louisiana before crossing into Mississippi, where it would stay on the ground for another 79 miles or 109 in total. This one also injured 510 and claimed 47 lives. Arkansas is a pretty simple state to cover, as it has only seen one F5 tornado in its history. It was an impactful one though, as on April 10, 1929, it tracked for 35 miles, injured 80, and claimed 23 lives. The activity in Missouri is slightly higher than its southern counterpart, as Missouri has seen 4 F or EF5 tornadoes. The first one occurred on June 15, 1912, just to the north of the town of Butler. The next instance was the beginning of the previously mentioned tri-state tornado on March 18, 1925. The third on the list occurred on May 20, 1957, when another F5 tornado touched down in Kansas and traveled 69 miles before crossing the border and dying in Missouri. Finally, the most recent one came on May 22, 2011, with the Joplin EF5. This beast injured 1,150 and claimed 158 lives, which makes it the 7th deadliest in U.S. history. As we arrive to Iowa, we see that the activity is still trending upwards. The Hawkeye State has seen 11 total F or EF5 tornadoes, with the first coming on June 17, 1882, and the most recent being on May 25, 2008. Although it was only rated as an EF4, it's also worth mentioning the May 21, 2024 Greenfield tornado. Mobile radar trucks recorded wind speeds of 309 to 318 miles per hour, which are only the third time ever that wind speeds upwards of 300 miles per hour were recorded in a tornado. This goes to show that despite the official rating, this was more than likely an EF5 and possibly even one of the strongest tornadoes that Iowa has ever seen. Wisconsin has seen slightly less activity, but has still recorded 6 F5 tornadoes itself. The first 3 on the list occurred back in the 1890s, which was led off by one on May 22, 1893, then on May 18, 1898, and finally June 12, 1899. The next one wouldn't happen for over half a century later, on June 4, 1958. The fifth one occurred on June 7, 1984, and finally the most recent instance was on July 18, 1996. While none of these F5s hold the record for the longest tracked in state history, the one on June 12, 1899 does hold the record for the deadliest. This one was on the ground for 30 miles, injured 200, and claimed 117 lives in total, which makes it the 9th deadliest in U.S. history. Moving west over to Minnesota, and we find that the state has recorded 8 F5 tornadoes. Once again, the first 3 in state history all occurred during the late 1800s, and the most recent one came over 100 years later on June 16, 1992. While it has seen some activity of its own, North Dakota is definitely quieter, as it has only seen 2 F5 tornadoes. Both of these actually came just a few years apart, with the first being on May 29, 1953, and the second one coming on June 20, 1957. Interestingly enough, both of these tornadoes were relatively short-lived and are nowhere close to the state record in terms of path length. However, the second tornado on this list, which traveled through the northern portion of Fargo and killed 10, surprisingly is the deadliest in state history. South Dakota is actually a similar state, as it has also only seen 2 F5 tornadoes in its history. The first of the 2 occurred on June 17, 1944, just north of Watertown. The second and most recent one occurred 21 years later on May 8, 1965, in the southern part of the state. As we continue heading back south, we notice that the activity once again starts picking back up, as Nebraska has seen 6 total F5s. The first one, which touched down on May 17, 1896, spent about 99% of its life in Kansas, but just barely crossed the border into Nebraska at the end of its life. The next 2 on the list both happened in 1908, with the first coming on April 23rd, followed by another on June 5th. The fourth occurred 3 decades later on May 22, 1933, which was followed by another 5 years later on April 26, 1938. Finally, the most recent came another 3 decades later on May 5, 1964. As we arrive to Kansas, we reach the state that has seen the most F or EF5 tornadoes. Kansas has seen 16 total tornadoes rated as the highest on the scale. The first in its history came on May 1, 1895, and the most recent occurred 112 years later with the May 4, 2007 Greensburg tornado. Some other notorious F5s in Kansas history include the March 13, 1990 Heston tornado and the April 26, 1991 Andover tornado. While the numbers do slightly drop off as we head south to Oklahoma, the state has still seen 13 F or EF5s. The first F5 tornado to have been recorded in the state occurred on May 10, 1905, and the most recent was the May 20, 2013 Moore tornado. Some other notable ones include the May 24, 2011 Piedmont tornado, and of course the May 3, 1999 Bridge Creek Moore tornado. This is one of the other tornadoes where wind speeds upwards of 300 miles per hour were recorded, specifically a 321 mile per hour gust, which is the highest ever measured wind speed on Earth. As we move southwards one more time, we get to Texas, which is the last state on the list. The Lone Star State has seen 11 total F5 tornadoes, with the first coming on May 15, 1896, just north of Dallas, and the most recent being the May 27, 1997 Gerald tornado. Although it was very slow moving, the Gerald tornado did produce some of the worst damage ever seen from a tornado, which makes us have to at least entertain the idea that this might be one of the strongest tornadoes of all time. And just like that, we have covered every single state, and this is what it looks like from a zoomed out look. We see that the data aligns pretty well with where the known traditional tornado hotspots are in the United States, along with just a few surprise entries. The final tally is 1 F0 or EF0 state, 1 F1 or EF1 state and/or territory, 5 F2 or EF2 states and/or territories, 11 F or EF3 states, 12 F or EF4 states, and finally 22 F or EF5 states.